What I would like to do is spend the next 8 or 10 minutes explaining to you some of the nuances of climate change in an agricultural setting. And obviously, it's particularly important in the context of New Zealand, because every time we hear of the extremes of climate change challenges, New Zealand gets mentioned. Now, if we look at where we're headed, we're coming here from a temperate period, which was the Holocene. And essentially, in recent times, we have changed the environment, and this is man-made change. And this has resulted in the emergence of a new epoch called the Anthropocene. Now, what human beings do seriously affects the climate on the planet and all the physical variables on the planet. So we are operating here in the Anthropocene. And we have the option, we're probably around here at present, so it's going to get worse before it gets better. But when it peaks here, we then have decided we have strategies in place which are going to remediate the problems we're presented with. If we do it properly, we're going to achieve this here. We get back to a stable state. And that means we need extreme control of climate variables at that stage. If we're partially successful, a little bit worse. If we don't get it right, we're in deep stuck. And we've got to decide in the next 20 years which of those areas we're going to get into. If we look at New Zealand, I get annoyed traveling internationally. Every time you talk to anybody about you've come from New Zealand, the first thing they alert you to is, oh, you're the guys who produce all the methane. So here, if we look on the right-hand side, you can see here, this is New Zealand. It has the highest per capita methane production on the planet. And most of that methane is linked to, or greenhouse gases are linked to agriculture, they say. So that means we're right in the gun. We depend on agriculture with GDP, and we seem to emit per capita a lot of greenhouse gases. And that's probably because we have a lot of ruminants and very few people. But the stats still come out, make us looking like we're causing some serious greenhouse gas emissions globally. What are the greenhouse gases and which ones should we be concerned with? Well, obviously we have carbon dioxide, which is a very common one, which is produced by forest fires, organic material, microorganisms, volcanoes. We have methane, which is obviously a molecule uniquely interesting in New Zealand. We have nitrous oxide, which emanates from manures from animals and nitrogen fertilizers. We have water vapor, which is the commonest greenhouse gas, which is responsible for about 75% of warming associated with greenhouse gases. And lastly, we have ozone, which is found up only in the stratosphere, which stops us getting burnt and damaged by UV light. If we look here, and we're obviously a little out of sync, you see here the important thing is that if we look at the different greenhouse gases, New Zealand is unique in that it has a remarkable contribution by methane to its green gas emission profile. It's about 44%, and the other 44% from carbon dioxide. You contrast that with anywhere else. Ireland is the closest at 16%, but in the main, they tend to be very low, around 13 or 10%. So that means that methane is a predominant and important gas in New Zealand, and it's, we say, linked with agriculture. If we look at the evidence of how greenhouse gas affects climate, we see the serial monitoring for CO2 and its linked with temperature. So we know CO2 is a greenhouse gas. If we look at methane, the other important greenhouse gas, we can see something interesting has happened here. It has increased systematically for a number of years. Then it seemed like we were leveling off, and suddenly we started getting it coming back again. So if we look at this and look at the coincidence of this graph with the emergence of fracking and mining for gases, we basically see here that from the moment we started fracking, we started to see a new surge in methane. So we may be looking at a world where the levels of methane may be more like we see in Ireland than, in fact, have been historically. So we here have an increasing amount of both of these gases. If we look at a major recent source of methane, it comes from fracking. And these here are untapped oil wells or gas wells found throughout the world. And you can see here, Turkmenistan is one of the predominant emitters of greenhouse gas, especially natural gas or methane. And there are many of these wells which are untapped, emit about 100 to 1,000 tons of methane per hour. So there's an incredible natural emission of methane all around these rich oil Middle Eastern countries. And a lot of these are untapped wells, and that's obviously an important source of environmental methane in our atmosphere, okay? If we look at other ways we've gone about farming, we see here we have feedlots for cattle, and they are getting closer to the industrial emissions than probably we had imagined. So we're looking at new forms of farming, which is highly intensified farming, which also is involved in producing. So you can detect the methane emitted from these sort of very intensively managed animals by satellite. If we look at how we could respond to the emissions of greenhouse gases from agriculture, we say we've got to the answer is in the soil. It's all in front of us. We live in a garden, which is in North Ireland and South Ireland, and that has within it really most of the possible things we need to solve greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. If we look at the bottom here, on the bottom where I've got that bar blocking it out, we see that there are ways we can farm which in fact mitigate existing greenhouse gases. And that is what we need to do is we need to choose very biodiverse plants. We need to choose plants which have deep rooting. We need to choose, we need to keep our ground covered, because if we look here at growing plants, this here is a second crop that covers the soil. If we don't have that, and if we have bare soil, we have huge emission of heat. That soil, as bare soil, can get up to 70 degrees, whereas if it's covered by vegetation, it'll never get above 20. So we have all kinds of ways we can farm better to remediate greenhouse gases. That is by using biodiverse crops, by using cover crops, by using deep-rooted plants, by having plants which have a rhizosphere or a fungal mat around them, and also bacteria and fungi in the soil. The other thing that's important is how we manage the crops we produce, because how animals graze crops is significantly important in influencing their effect on climate. And here we have, there we had. There we are, I'm sorry. So if we look here now and see what are the important things we can target to influence climate. And the most important molecule on the planet for, gosh, good God. Could you believe that? You could. Okay. So carbon is the molecule we look to as a panacea for greenhouse gas control. And here we can see the things carbon does in the soil. It obviously allows us to produce food. It can sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It can do all sorts of things. So this is an amazing molecule which influences almost every function on the planet. Everything in the world is influenced by the amount of carbon and where that carbon is found. If it's found in the soil, it can obviously attenuate carbon dioxide emissions and the like. And here, as you can see, soil where we have buried carbon is on this side here. And when we, in fact, modify our farming practices to increase soil carbon, we essentially achieve that. That brings us to an important question, and that is, can we farm in a different way to sequester carbon and to change the footprint made by ruminants when we grow ruminants for milk or meat? And here you can see an example. If we use that regenerative approach to agriculture, we can, in fact, produce meat and store carbon at the same time. So we can, for every kilogram of meat, store 3 kilograms of carbon. So that means we can manage in unique ways, and you can see these other ways. There's a huge cost when we farm these ways. Here we can see beef on a feedlot in the United States costs 23 kgs of carbon per kg of meat. So the way we farm can influence our management of some of these greenhouse gases. We use plants of different types because they harvest different nutrients in the soil. So we have to move away from monocultures to polycultures, and that allows us to capture the full potential of soil when we grow plants. Not alone the plants we grow are important, but also the way we manage the pastures. And here's an example of a polydiverse pasture. A polydiverse pasture where the animals go in and they do beautiful things. Time's up, okay? Just finish that slide. Here you can see the magic of ruminants managing pasture and influencing climate. And what happens is when animals graze a mixed pasture, the grazing means they obviously eat the top of the grass. That produces organic compounds and isoprenes, which are there to protect the plant from being eaten totally. Then once you produce isoprenes and volatile molecules, you then produce hydroxyl radicals, and the hydroxyl radicals neutralize methane, which means animals that pasture are not alone capable of producing methane, they're also capable of neutralizing it and eliminating it. So the one thing we have to do is when we look at farming is say it's completely different from industrial greenhouse gases. Industry doesn't have a capacity to remediate the molecules it produces, animals do. So instead of being concerned about the production of greenhouse gases by your animals, if animals are managed correctly, you can in fact end up using them as a reservoir for stored carbon dioxide, which could be stored deep in the soil ad infinitum.